This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth begins today's show with an update on the pests that growers could be seeing in their soybean fields. He describes the beanleaf beetle, painted lady, and blister beetle. Rich Llewelyn, K-State Extension Assistant, continues today's show with a preview of the Risk and Profit Conference and other events and webinars that take place with K-State's Agricultural Economics Department. Wrapping up the show is K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Riley County, Gregg Eyestone, as he discusses heat-related issues with tomatoes, spider mites, and planting a fall garden. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Thursday show talking about some pests that people might be seeing in their crop fields. And then to talk about it, we're joined by K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. Jeff, thanks for joining us today.
Sure, anytime. My pleasure.
Jeff, a pest that you've gotten a few pictures about from producers in their soybean fields, beanleaf beetles.
The beanleaf beetle is probably our number one pest in soybeans throughout the soybean growing regions in the whole United States. They have been a pest forever. They're going to be a pest as far into the future as we can see, and they're not going away. Beanleaf beetles in Kansas, we're seeing adults now, but there's also some larval feeding going on, which most growers don't realize. So just a quick refreshment about the biology of the beanleaf beetle. In Kansas, there are two different color phases. There's a pink color phase and a tan color phase. They both have black spots and a black border around their top, but they're often confused with the southern corn rootworm. That's important because southern corn rootworm adults can build up in vast numbers, and if you're out looking for beanleaf beetles and you see a bunch of southern corn rootworms and you can't distinguish the two, you may get excited. The southern corn rootworm adult is feeding on pollen. They won't feed on the bean, they won't feed on the pod, they won't feed on the leaf very much, just pollen. So there can be a lot of them out there, but it's not going to cause a problem. They don't bother the corn either. So the beanleaf beetle adult right now is feeding on the foliage. For the most part, they're feeding on the leaves. They leave kind of a characteristic round or oval hole when they feed. It's not like grasshoppers or some of the other things that, just pretty well decimate the leaves. These things, they look like they're kind of careful feeders, kind of neat feeders, just a round hole or an oblong hole. Generally speaking, we don't need to treat for the defoliation caused by the adult. Lots of times people get excited about it because there can be quite a few adults feeding on the foliage. Usually the beans are growing pretty well and they can, recover from a lot of leaf feeding, especially early on. The adults can feed on the leaves. Problem I think that we don't concern ourselves with as much are they lay eggs around the base of the plant, and these eggs hatch into larvae, and the larvae will feed on the roots and the root hairs of the plant. The larvae look just almost exactly like a corn rootworm larva. I can't tell the difference unless I put them under a microscope, actually. The difference being corn rootworm larvae feed on corn roots, beanleaf beetle larvae feed on soybean roots. So if they're on the soybeans, they're a beanleaf beetle. So if you have a spot in your field where the plants look, the growers call it a weak spot in the field, or places where the plants are kind of wilty and looking stressed, go out and pull up some of the plants and look at the roots. There are probably little white larvae hanging onto the roots, or maybe they'll be feeding inside the stem below ground of the plant. That's the larval stage of the beanleaf beetle. There's a lot of those right now going into that stage. So pretty soon those larvae will pupate, they'll quit feeding, and then they'll become adults again. Those adults then will emerge. At that point in time, generally they'll feed on the pods. Now, there's a definite distinction I want to make between the feeding of the adult beanleaf beetle and the podworm, or the larval stage of the corn earworm. The beanleaf beetle adult feeds on the pod. The corn earworm or podworm, whatever you want to call it, same insect, they feed on the seeds within the pod. The beanleaf beetle adults will feed on those pods from now until September, October, till there are no more green pods in the fields. That's the problem. They're feeding on the marketable part of the plant. They're feeding on the pod, which oftentimes opens up and causes the seed inside to dry out, or they can actually transmit some diseases, which is not a big problem in Kansas, but they can. So as soon as those plants start setting pods, those bean leaf beetle adults will start feeding on those pods. And at that point in time is when you need to get out and sample and monitor and make sure you don't hit the treatment threshold stage. And that treatment threshold, again, it doesn't take very many to cause a problem because they're feeding on the marketable stage. So generally, if you got, 1 or 2 per row foot feeding on the pods, that's cause for concern. If you don't find any worms, don't spray for the worms. They're pupating. They're down in the soil. So another 2 weeks, 3 weeks, their cycle is going to come out, and then they're going to move over to sorghum and become headworms. And we can talk about that in another 2 or 3 weeks. Mainly, we're looking at the adults feeding on the foliage and the laying eggs in the larval stage, feeding on the root hairs and the roots in the soil. There are some insecticides that work pretty well. Seed treatments work for the larval stage. The problem with seed treatments, they only last 21 to 28 days, so they're probably not still effective on the larval feeding. So it's the time to get out and look for the bean leaf beetle right now, and also the painted lady. Some of the guys that were in last week for the talks that we had between Cara and Kansas State were saying they're seeing painted lady butterflies flying around alfalfa fields and soybean fields. They're really not a problem in alfalfa, but in soybeans, the painted ladies are laying eggs on the leaves. Those eggs will hatch, and they hatch into a little larvae that we call the thistle caterpillar. The thistle caterpillar, then, it's a little real hairy, spiny-looking larva. The problem is the eggs hatch on the leaf. As that larva crawls around, it will release some silk threads, and it will pull the leaf over itself so it's hidden within the leaf, providing a nice little safe shelter for it to feed on. So it's acerbated by dry conditions. So if the soybeans, especially under dry, non-irrigated conditions, if they're being besieged by bean leaf beetle adults feeding on the foliage and the thistle caterpillars are feeding on the foliage, it can be tough for the plants to do well. The thistle caterpillar is tough to get to. You can kill it, but it's getting the contact insecticide, which is what most of them are that are registered for thistle caterpillars, to where the actual insect is. As I said, they have this silken thread, and they cover themselves with leaf tissue and silk, and they feed in there just nice, safe, and shady, and feed away, defoliating the plants. If you have 100% infestation, which I have seen in the last few years, it can be really tough. Those plants can't keep up, especially under dry conditions. So right now, what I'm most worried about in the soybeans are the defoliators, the bean leaf beetle adult, and the thistle caterpillar, neither one of which have reached treatment thresholds over large areas yet, hoping they don't, and hoping we get some rain for the dryland growers. But right now, that's kind of the situation with soybeans.
Jeff, wanting to mention another insect you've received some phone calls about, blister beetles.
Yes, I've received some pictures and some calls about blister beetles. This year, more so probably than the last 3 or 4 years. Blister beetles are a problem in soybeans because they're defoliators. I've not seen them be a field-wide problem in soybeans. They can build up in vast numbers. By vast numbers, I mean thousands or hundreds of thousands individuals in a small area. At that point in time, they're defoliating pretty good, but they're mainly aggregating for mating purposes. So if you watch a swarm like that in soybeans, they're constantly coming and going where the males and the females come and they mate and they feed a little bit and they take off. You can spray them in soybeans and kill them. If the area is big enough and you're worried enough, you got enough defoliators, you can kill the blister beetles. Alfalfa is the crop that we worry about. The same thing can happen in alfalfa, and a lot of times guys want to spray it. We do not recommend spraying blister beetles in alfalfa just because you can kill them. That's what the insecticide's for, right? Makes sense to me. The problem with alfalfa, when you kill the blister beetles, the blister beetle, the substance that causes the problem with blister beetles is called cantharidin. The adult blister beetles produces cantharidin. It oozes out, or it's produced between the segments of its body, and that's the product that causes blistering of humans if you get it on your skin. And trust me, I've had it several times. They do blister. And if a herbivore or a cow or a goat or a sheep or especially a horse consumes the hay or the insect that has the cantharidin, that can be really problematic. It can either cause sickness or it can actually cause death, especially horses. The thing about the blister beetle in Kansas, there's 3 or 4 different really common species. They're laying eggs right now, or they will be in another month or 2. Those eggs hatch, and those larval stage of the blister beetle feeds on grasshopper eggs. The grasshoppers, as they come out now, and they'll start mating and they'll start laying eggs in the ground, the larval blister beetles will start looking for those eggs and feeding on them, so they're actually beneficial. So anytime you have a large population of grasshoppers, that's kind of a magnet for blister beetle adults. They go to the same kind of foliage where the grasshoppers are feeding. They lay eggs in the ground, and then their larval form will feed on the eggs of the grasshopper. So they're beneficial. The problem is there's not near enough blister beetles to control the grasshoppers, because every year we have a lot of grasshoppers. If they're in soybeans and you think they're causing a problem, you can treat them. It's not a problem. In alfalfa, don't. Let them go away naturally. The other question I always get, can you certify alfalfa as being blister beetle free? You can, but you can't really guarantee it's blister beetle free. The first and the fifth or the last cutting are the ones that have the least chance of being infested with blister beetles. But other than that, you can find blister beetles just about any time in an alfalfa field. And it just doesn't take very many to cause a problem with whatever herbivore you're feeding that hay to. So just a word of warning to folks out there. Right now we got some insects. They're looking for moisture and they're looking for food and they're aggregating to lay eggs. So keep all that in mind as you're monitoring your crops.
That was K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about some upcoming conferences and webinars through K-State's Department of Agricultural Economics with K-State Extension Assistant Rich Llewelyn. Rich, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Rich, first wanting to touch on the Risk and Profit Conference that's coming up in about a month.
It is. August 15th and 16th are the dates for that. It's the Thursday and Friday before classes start here at K-State. So we'll have a 2-day meeting with some general sessions, and then we'll have 22 different breakout sessions that folks will be able to choose 7 of those.
And is there almost a theme for the conference this year?
It's kind of widespread, but policy and practical things would kind of be the major theme. We have a main speaker, a keynote speaker coming from USDA. He's the chief economist for U.S. Department of Agriculture, Seth Meyer. And so he'll be talking about policy, but also have some outlook on farm income for the year and just some things going on in the agriculture world.
Excited to have Seth here, I'm sure, but also seeing some important K-State people also talking at the Risk and Profit Conference.
The rest of our speakers are from the K-State Ag Econ Department. We'll have Dan O'Brien with Grain Outlook. That'll be one of the general sessions on Friday, and the other one on Friday will be a Livestock Market Outlook with Glenn Tonser from our department. And then we have, like I mentioned, 22 different topics in the breakout sessions from our faculty. It's a good chance for them to get engaged with farmers and lenders and others in the ag community, and for folks to meet them and talk to them on some of their recent research.
Rich, can you preview a couple of those breakout session topics or what they're going to be?
We've got quite a few going on, but some of them are policy-oriented. Jenny Ift is our Flinchbaugh chair for farm policy, and so she's going to look at why do we have a farm safety net. She's also looking at some other things that deal with conservation and Kansas farm income. We have another one that's looking at transition planning, and it'll be a discussion with Ashley Westerhold. We have some livestock topics as well, feedlot adoption of methane emission mitigating technology, as well as some insights on meat demand from Glenn Tonser. So there's a wide variety of things going on.
And another speaker, someone who's involved in a conversation at the Risk and Profit Conference. Who's this year's Kansas farmer that is having a conversation with the group?
We're going to have Clayton Short from Assyria, just south of Salina. He farms there. It's a crop farm and dryland crops, so he'll be featured for our Risk and Profit Conference this year. It's an interesting conversation. Eric Atkinson will be back to talk with Clayton and just hear of how he's developed his operation over the years.
And who do you recommend take the time to attend this Risk and Profit Conference?
It's anyone interested in agriculture in Kansas. We have a lot of farmers and a lot of ag lenders, but we also have crop insurance agents. We have agribusiness managers and owners. So it's anyone that's involved significantly with agriculture in Kansas.
You mentioned this is taking place August 15th through the 16th. And what are some of the details for registration and parking and other things like that?
Well, the conference takes place at the K-State Alumni Center, which is on the south side by Memorial Stadium of the K-State campus, and we have a hotel block at the Ramada or the Holiday Inn, used to be the Ramada Inn, across the street. So parking can be at the Alumni Center or in the parking garage across the street. So that makes it pretty easy, and everything's just right there. The conference fee is $235 for both days. We also have a one-day registration of $185. And so folks can come for the whole thing, or if they're just available one day or another, they can come for that.
And is there an early registration?
There is. We'd like to have these registrations in no later than August 12th, I believe it is. And the hotel block will actually close the first part of August 1st. They'll need to get their hotel reservation.
And wanting to talk about some other things that people can find on Ag Manager from the Ag Econ department here at K-State, the Ukraine-Russia conflict updates.
Right. Actually, one of the sessions at the Risk and Profit Conference will be Antonina Broyaka, who is a former dean at Vinnytsia University in Ukraine. She's been here for about 2.5 years now and is working in providing updates on what's going on in the Black Sea region with grain markets and international trade, the food markets going on there. And so she'll have a session here, but she also is doing some monthly webinars, and we don't have another one scheduled for sure, but look for that coming in September again.
And we often hear from Dan O'Brien here on Agriculture Today, and we'll be hearing from him at the Risk and Profit Conference. But he also does another webinar with Mark Nelson from Kansas Farm Bureau.
Right. The next one of those will be July 22nd, and registration's available on the AgManager.info website. So Dan and Mark will be looking at where the grain markets are and also where folks should be with some of their pricing for pre-harvest sales, as well as if they still have some grain from last year, what they ought to be doing with that.
And these webinars are free, just need to register for them?
That's correct.
Wonderful. And just wanting to make a mention of another conference that's taking place with Ag Econ, the Kansas Landowner Conference.
Right. So for landowners who are out of state or in state, dealing with tenants in a lot of cases, folks who may not understand all that's going on, we've got this. We tried it last year and had a good turnout, and so we're trying it again on October 10th and 11th. It'll be a little earlier than it was last year, and registration is actually open for that, and they can find more information on AgManager.info.
And Rich, you've mentioned AgManager.info. We mentioned it many times on Ag Today. What are all the different things that people might be able to find on that website?
Well, we have a whole bunch of stuff there, but some of the more popular things are the custom rates information that just came out here at the end of June. That comes out every 2 years, and we have the newest edition or version of that the end of June, providing the rates for different tillage and harvesting operations. So that's very helpful. We also have the grain marketing information that Dan O'Brien does, and we have quite a bit of livestock information with Glenn Tonzer. We have some of the livestock marketing charts as well as grain marketing charts available as well, kind of showing what's going on in the current markets.
If people aren't able to find the information they need on these conferences or these webinars on AgManager.info, how could they maybe have some questions answered?
They could contact me. My email is rvl@ksu.edu, or they could give me a phone call, 785-532-1504.
Rich, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us some information from K-State's Ag Econ department.
Thanks for having me.
That was K-State Extension Assistant Rich Llewelyn. You can find out more information about all these events and webinars from K-State's Agricultural Economics Department by going to AgManager.info. I would like to remind you specifically of the Risk and Profit Conference that is coming up August 15th and 16th. Before we cut to a break, we are now going to be joined by USDA's Gary Crawford, Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack, and USDA economist Megan Schweitzer as they talk about how a new report suggests that food price inflation is leveling off.
I'm fairly confident that we're headed in the right direction.
The right direction. Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack's reaction the other day after looking at the latest Consumer Food Price Index report, which showed another month of zero grocery store food price inflation. USDA economist Megan Schweitzer told us.
So this month in particular, we saw food at home prices were flat over the month. And in fact, food at home prices have been flat for 3 out of the 4 most recent months.
And Ag Secretary Vilsack told reporters that compared to prices a year ago,
the grocery store cost of food is now at an inflation rate of a little over 1%, which is well below the 20-year average for the inflation rate for food purchased from the grocery store.
On average, food prices generally go up each year by about 2.5%. During the height of COVID, the inflation rate was as high as 11.5%. But since then, and especially this year,
we've seen prices for groceries in particular really level off.
With some foods dropping in price, some others going up. In fact, during June, of the 15 food categories that Megan tracks,
in June, prices rose for 7 categories, declined for 6 categories, and stayed the same for 2 categories. So really, that was what was leading to our no change overall, was sort of that balance between those categories declining and rising.
On the list of price declines during June,
prices fell the most for fresh fruits. Prices were down by 2.6% in June. And so this is at least partially a seasonal factor, where prices fall when fresh fruits come into season domestically. Fresh vegetables as well, we've seen declining prices for 4 months straight.
Overall, price declines month by month have taken prices for some foods down below what they were a year ago at this time.
Prices for fish and seafood are 1% lower than they were a year ago. Prices for fresh fruits are 1.7% lower than they were a year ago. Fresh vegetables are down by 0.3%. And dairy products are down just a smidge by 0.1%.
On the flip side, several products are selling for higher prices than this time a year ago, such as fats and oils. That includes butter. Those fats and oil products are 4% higher. Beef is over 5% higher. And eggs are still costing 10% more than they did this time last year. Gary Crawford reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you ahead.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. The recent extreme heat in Kansas has impacted some home gardeners, especially those growing tomatoes. K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Riley County, Gregg Eyestone, reminds gardeners that tomatoes can be picked and allowed to ripen off the vine. Greg, first off, maybe just a little background on what you've been seeing so far in terms of crops and how the crops are doing this year.
Yeah, I think there's always variables from region to region and backyard to backyard. You have people, neighbors talking about, well, my tomatoes are doing fine. Others, I'm still waiting for my first one to harvest. And so on tomatoes, you can harvest those as soon as they start to turn a little color for you, and that just kind of helps prevent some potential problem down the road. If you have a quick rainstorm that comes through here in the summertime, that often cracks a lot of our tomatoes and fruit, and so if you can harvest right before that, that prevents that wasted fruit production. And so harvesting tomatoes when they start to turn a little color, you're not going to have any better flavor. You'll get maybe some better color if you bring them in the house where the temperature is a little more moderate, typically during the summertime. And so that's a good thing to do.
We've had that extended heat for several days. Is there anything that goes wrong in the garden when we see that?
Back to the tomato situation, we're going to have poor pollination when it's elevated temperatures, meaning there'll be a lull in some fruit production. And the ripening is a situation, too. It doesn't ripen very quickly when it's really hot. And so, again, when you get a little bit of color in that fruit, go ahead and pull it off. Bring it in the house, and it'll color up more pretty for you.
Any pests that you're hearing about?
Well, hot temperatures, we're going to have spider mites. If we have produce that's been fertilized, that seems like spider mites like the lush growth of fruit and vegetables, and so check for those. Fairly easy to see. You see discoloration on your leaf tissue. The easiest way is take a piece of white paper out there, put it underneath the leaf, tap on it. Mites don't stick to the leaves very easily, and so you'll either see them crawling on that white piece of paper, or if you take your hand and kind of crush them, you'll see some smearing, and that would be an indication of mites. A good control measure is just a high-pressure water spray. Again, they don't cling to the leaf very easily, and just taking your hose and washing the underside of your leaves where most of those mites are would be a good way to manage that.
As we continue to harvest, we probably also need to start thinking ahead to fall gardening.
It is. I don't know if people have some seed potatoes left over that they didn't get planted, or maybe they thought ahead. Typically, we can't find them very easily for purchase, but if you do have some seed potatoes that you put maybe in the refrigerator to store them, we do plant those here in mid-July. It needs that growing season to go ahead and mature. And as we look towards cooler temperatures, dreaming of cooler temperatures at least in August and September, we want to think about replanting a lot of those cool season vegetables because they will go ahead and mature in the cool crispness of the fall, and that typically gives us elevated freshness and flavor to those vegetables. They'll taste different than they do in the spring when they're maturing in those warm temperatures. So it's a fun thing to try. And there's lots of resources out there. One thing we like to sometimes grow is broccoli and cauliflower and those type of cole crops. And we need to get those started here into July, first part of August, so that they'll be ready for planting really into the garden. Cool season vegetables means they like cooler temperatures than maybe what we have. And so those typically we can start in the basement or someplace where it's cooler inside with artificial light or supplemental light to get those up to a transplanting stage that we can put those out into the garden as the season starts to come around.
Do we need to plan out the garden, know exactly where we want to plant them?
Yeah, it's always good to kind of rotate our crops. And so if you had, let's say, our broccoli and cauliflower in a location that probably got voided because you harvested them, may not want to go back in that same location if you have options there. Probably a couple years in the same place is not going to be a big deal, but we do like to rotate our crops as we can.
Extension has some publications that really talk about planting dates, so they might want to check that out as well.
Yes, of course, the Kansas Garden Guide is our large book that's wonderful. You can download that, view it online. There is a calendar in there, kind of gives you an idea of when to be planting. And I think there's also a section specifically or a chapter on fall vegetable gardening that would be a great reference to look at.
That's K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Riley County, Gregg Eyestone. The Kansas Garden Guide is available online and through the K-State Research and Extension Bookstore. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.